All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Massachusetts Pollinator Network seminar series. I'm so glad that all of you are here. My name is Rosemary Malfi. I am the Massachusetts Pollinator Network Coordinator at the Northeast Organic Farming Association, Massachusetts Chapter, or NOFA-MAS for short. And I am delighted to welcome all of you to tonight's seminar on pollinators in the woods. And I will introduce our speaker in just a moment, but before I do, I just wanted to share some information with you. So for folks who might be unfamiliar, the Massachusetts Pollinator Network is a program at NOFA-MAS to support and connect the many individuals and community groups across the Commonwealth who are working on aspects of pollinator protection. And this includes ecological landscaping, habitat construction, and reducing reliance on pesticides. In addition to serving as a resource center and communication hub, we also engage in education and advocacy work at the local and state levels, including hosting regular seminar events like this one. You can visit masspollinatornetwork.org to read more about our mission and see some of our programming. And I will introduce our speaker this evening. I am very delighted and we are very honored to be hosting Dr. Kass Urban-Mead from the Xerces Society. Kass earned a master's degree at the Yale School of Forestry and completed her doctoral work in the Cornell Entomology Department, where her work focused on characterizing the wild bees active in early spring forests and forest canopies, and how the movement of bees between forests and orchards can support orchard pollination. In her position with the Xerces Society, Dr. Urban-Mead provides technical assistance on pollinator conservation in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast regions of the United States. This involves assisting with planning, designing, installing, and managing habitat for pollinators and other beneficial insects. Kass also works with staff and research partners to develop technical guidelines and to provide training on pollinator conservation practices. We are very delighted to have you here tonight, Kass. You can take it away.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, yes.
Yes, we got you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Rosemary. Hi, everyone. This is a really big crowd, and it is just absolutely a thrill to be here tonight. And I wish I could come to the rest of the events you have planned for this month because they look awesome. Definitely leave the leaves. So yeah, we have kind of a, can you see the presentation correctly and all? I don't see what you're seeing anymore. Okay. I'm seeing you nodding, Rosemary. So
yeah. We can see it. We're good.
Sorry to double check. Just didn't want to get started and be off. So we have a kind of a funny topic today. So I'm going to kind of ground us in bee biology and then circle out to why in the world we're talking about pollinators in the forest, right? So as Rosemary said, I finished my graduate work at Cornell recently, and I'm just thrilled to have joined the Xerces team. All right. So I had said that we were going to throw this in the chat box, but I'm realizing that we probably don't have access to the chat, everybody, which is my fault, but I am imagining, and just kind of to ground everybody, that there's probably a range of folks here, from people who have just kind of started to think about pollinators as they've heard more discussion, from beginner gardeners to master gardeners, educators, maybe folks who are natural resource professionals, people working in agriculture, and maybe people working in forest management. So I'm keeping kind of all of those audiences in mind. So bear with me as we try to kind of think about all the ways that bees might connect to your lives, because hopefully there'll be something for everyone. All right. So just as an introduction to the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, if you are not familiar already, oh, I am seeing some folks. Shoot. I would love to know your answers. Go ahead and keep throwing those in and I'll see them. And I'll start talking about Xerces in the meantime, which is that we are an international nonprofit conservation organization working in conservation via science and evidence-based work, but with groups from around the country. And this is just so exciting. Look at all these gardeners, educators, longtime gardeners, landowners, NRCS folks, people who have forests. Very cool. Students, educators, some folks who are interested. Also photographers, a great way to observe. Very cool. Researchers, native plant professionals, very cool. Really excited to have you all here. Thank you. And I know I have lots to learn from each of you from all of your experiences. So I really hope that we can have like a collaborative discussion at the end. All right, feel free to keep sharing and I'm going to keep work going on here. So Xerces' work covers pollinators and conservation biocontrol. And I am on the pollinator team, but we have a focused endangered species team. We have folks who work on fireflies and on aquatic invertebrates and what that means for water quality. We have a really incredible pesticide team, some of whom do research, others do recommendations for on the ground management, and others are thinking about policy. If you or your campus or municipality is interested in a certification, we have a Bee Better certified and a Bee City campus, which is a little bit more of an involved process to get those certifications, and then lots of community science projects. So cool to see all of the different ways that everybody's engaging with pollinator work. So thanks for sharing those experiences. If you're here, you probably already have some of these thoughts, but I think it's helpful to ground us in why we care about insects and invertebrate conservation generally. So I like this quote: "The fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own," both as kind of canaries in a coal mine, but also in these really specific ways, such as nutrient cycling and decomposition. The free pest control services they offer in agricultural and garden settings alike. Even if you're not that big on invertebrates, although I bet most of you are today, but even if you're not, if you have friends who like birds, insects are just an absolutely fundamental part of our food chain. And then of course, as a pollinator expert, helping plants reproduce, seed set, fruit set, and so many of our most important and nutritious fruits, vegetables, and other foods are in some part of their life cycle dependent on pollination. And you've probably seen this photograph before, but when we think about not just direct pollination to fruits and vegetables, but also the ways that many seeds and then even crops like alfalfa, which in turn are important for livestock, up to at least 1 in 3 mouthfuls, and especially many of our most nutrient-dense foods are reliant on pollinators. So this is, kind of an exciting drawing meant to illustrate what it would look like if we lost all of the insect-dependent crops. So exciting in the sense of shocking, of course, not something we'd ever want to happen. And so this brings us to the need for conservation action. We know that pollinators are experiencing rapid and alarming declines. Around 28% of our bumblebees are threatened. You may know that the rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, was listed as an endangered species. Endangered monarch populations, even in the east here, we have seen a decline of 90% since the 1990s. We think that over 17% of North American butterflies are at risk. And this, of course, these numbers come from our most charismatic species, but who are easiest to study, meaning kind of large and recognizable, familiar. But there are many, many thousands of more species who are more difficult to observe or maybe less well studied over time. And we know that many of those are also in decline. And I think I said this a little bit already, but it's just a reminder that this biodiversity is the crucial element in successful pollination, not just of crops, but also of many wild plants and rare and declining wildflowers who have really specific and specialized relationships with many of our wildflowers. And research increasingly shows that more species are needed the longer the time scale and the broader the spatial scale you're thinking about. So if you take just a snapshot, you may say, oh, just a small number of species are really good for this one crop. But when you think about time variability or the way that habitats vary across space, we really need this buffer of many, many different kinds of species in order to ensure these relationships with the reproduction of so many plants on whom we depend. And today my talk is really going to be, we're heading towards a natural history talk about bees in the woods, and that is really part of the habitat piece of the story. And when we're thinking about many of the threats facing our pollinators and other beneficial insects, Habitat is one of the biggest ones. And that's where I'm going to focus today, but I just wanted to highlight that it is connected also to invasive plant species, monoculture, agriculture, biodiversity loss, and the synergies of all of those topics with pesticides, pathogens and diseases, and other pressures such as climate change, which together can make for a really complicated death by 1,000 cuts. But if we want to restore specifically habitat, and especially habitat with those other pressures in mind, we really need to understand pollinator biology, pollinator life cycles, and their food and nesting requirements. And I hope that when we get into the forest, it'll seem more clear why, because it's not always obvious what those habitat requirements are. And so that is part of why it's important to understand. We might just say, oh, flowers, that's it. And that's true. We definitely need flowers. But some of the requirements for supporting pollinators may be a little bit more cryptic or a little more less obvious. And so hopefully this intuition that we'll build tonight will help with that concrete conservation action. And so, as I said, we absolutely do know, and there's lots of evidence for meadows and the wonderful gardens I see people mentioning that they maintain, and herbaceous flowers. And then today we're going to talk a little bit more about the less well-known relationships of pollinators with trees and shrubs and forests. All right, I'm talking quickly because I wanted to get through, but I'm going to try and get my pacing just right. So, we're going to do a little bit of that background knowledge first, kind of think about those life cycles and those bee biology that's crucial for understanding the relationships of bees in the woods. And then we'll talk about specifically some interactions of bees in forests. So specialists on spring ephemerals, nesting habitat, the ways bees use canopy resources. And then we'll talk about this kind of group that has recently been classified as forest-associated bees, and then talk about management. All right, so biology-wise, just our off the bat reminder that we are not talking about the European honeybee. As much as I also love honeybees, they are not our typical bee. They have an unusual biology, the highly social, complicated division of labor that probably everyone learned about at least once, maybe the waggle dance you heard about in school. But they are in fact a domesticated animal that's best thought of as livestock. Honeybees arrived with the colonists in the 1600s and are not native to the continent. They are very, very important for crop pollination and provide honey and other hive products, but they're not at risk of extinction. They're globally secure, and the problems are localized. And this is really an agricultural pursuit, not a conservation strategy. So in the sense that chickens are an agricultural managed species that we want for eggs and we like for meat. And I love chickens. I eat eggs every day. Similarly, I love honeybees. But the analogy is that we would not keep chickens in order to save the wild birds, right? It sounds silly when you say it like that. And similarly, for all the reasons we love honeybees, keeping honeybees is not a conservation activity, it's an agricultural activity. So now's your chance. What are the other kinds of bees? We know now that the honeybee is an agricultural bee. What are the other types of pollinators? Go ahead and you throw in other types of bees, but also other types of pollinators. I already see a mason bee starting off strong. No silly answers, go for it. Leafcutter bees, birds, flies. Yes, flies are fantastic pollinators. Beetles, carpenter bees, Perdita, awesome. The fairy bees, syrphid flies, orchid bees, awesome. The humble bumble, yes, doing their work. Digger bees, also, yep, mining bees, very cool. Sweat bees, mason bees. All right, so we've got a crowd. This is good. Bats, absolutely, right? So bees are not the only pollinators. I'm going to predominantly talk about bees today, simply because there's so many of them and they've already hard to squish it all down to one talk. But yes, pollinators, hoverflies, cool. And so I'm going to just address the wasps right now because I realize I don't have that elsewhere in the talk, which is just that wasps are cousins of bees, and it's kind of simple to think about bees as fuzzy vegetarian cousins of wasps. So instead of eating other insects or feeding their young on other insects, bees feed their young on pollen. And so the fuzziness is to help them carry that pollen back to their nests. All right, so very cool. So we've seen there's a lot of cool knowledge of lots of other pollinators. And indeed, these native bees come in all shapes and sizes. On the different lifestyles, they're active at different times of year. And in fact, we said that the honeybee super social life cycle is unusual, right? So actually 70% of the native bees who live on in the United States are solitary and ground nesting, not like a ground bee, which is a term I grew up scared of, which were usually highly social wasps. But instead, these are gentle, solitary bees who are living in their own special nest. And so each bee does not have any instinct to chase after people because they're just one little insect and there would be no benefit to sacrificing themselves because there's no colony to sacrifice themselves for. So they stay very, very gentle unless you really squish them. Then there's 30% of our bees are solitary and stem and wood nesting. So this is a little Seratina poking out of a stem. And then our bumblebees are indeed social nesting, although only the queens live through the winter and the colony does not. So in that sense, they're different from the social overwintering behavior of honeybees. And so when we think about solitary bees, the majority of their lives are spent in their juvenile stages in those nests, whether under the ground, in a stem, in a rotting log, or another kind of cavity or small crevice. And it's really helpful when we start to think about the life cycles of these bees to kind of map it out. So this is one example of a solitary soil nesting bee who's active in the spring. And what we're going to talk about is how bees are active all times of year. But if we start as our bee underground in January, first the males are going to emerge and then the females, there's time to mate there. And this is when the females are super active, going back and forth to the flowers, gathering as much pollen as they can to create a large pollen ball. In this case, a soil nesting bee is creating her pollen ball under the ground. And then for the rest of the season, that egg hatches and the larvae develops, and then they wait all through the winter before it's time to eclose into an adult bee again the next spring. And different bees are going to be active at different times of year. So there may be other bees who are active in the midsummer, others in the fall, but this is a good way to think about how brief the life cycle of a solitary bee can be. And when you're thinking about these small bees, they often can't fly very far. They may only fly 250 meters if they're very small, up to 1 kilometer, and because they have to go back and forth all day from that central nest. Unlike other insects, which can kind of fly itinerantly and continue to move across the landscape wherever resources are, bees are what we call foragers who come from a central place that they have to get back and forth from. And so that really helps us think about what the resources are that they need around their nests. So here's our little bee, and there's maybe a radius of which resources are available. And so this is a grounding for some bees are out for just a very short period of time, and then we know that they can only go a certain distance. So when we know that bees are positively associated with forest habitats, and that in some agricultural settings, there's reliable evidence that bees are more abundant near the forest, we might ask why. And indeed, just to kind of emphasize what those data look like, when we have an agricultural crop that has a higher proportion of forest nearby, there's a higher diversity and richness of bees. Within an orchard row, there are often a higher diversity and abundance of bees closer to the forest edge, and then that drops off the further you get from the forest. And in many cases, this has even been associated with higher nutritional or fruit quality by other metrics. And so this decline is really, really interesting that we see this consistent relationship. So why are we looking in the woods? One kind of hypothesis to help us think about why these relationships might be is that forest is both the current and pre-colonial dominant land cover of the northeastern US. And although, especially, I think if you don't spend a lot of time in forests and with forest management, it's easy to think of them as kind of a static ecosystem or something that after a meadow goes through succession and stops at a forest is kind of done. But the more time you spend kind of looking at a forest over a series of really over lifetimes, so this involves data or being an active forest manager, it becomes clear that forests are complex dynamic systems with constant disturbances and changes within them. Active ecological management is crucial for forest health, given the impact that we have had on the landscape and the changes that we've made to the forest already. So it's good to think in context how people have always played a major role in forest composition. There was active indigenous management by the native people who were and are still here. And the compositional legacy of colonial land clearing is really strong. The certain papers who have tried to characterize this using witness trees and historical and colonial data show that after the almost entire land clearing that was done during the colonial period and then regrowth, we've left a really strong stamp on the landscape. And so the forests often need a lot of support in order to be their maximally healthy, have to be at maximal health. And some of the other reasons for this include really, really high levels of deer. Certain level are fine, but when you're out of whack, it can kind of lead to really severe overbrowsing and difficulty for trees to regenerate. We have suppressed a lot of historical disturbances, including the type that indigenous people used to do frequently. We have a high need for climate resiliency. There's lots of pest and pathogen pressures in our forests. We've probably all lived through different waves of forest tree losses due to pests that require changes. And then of course, fuel loading and changes in fire regimes. And so one thing that's really exciting as we think about the ways bees play into forests is that ecological forestry already exists as a well-developed and active field that is working to keep forests healthy into the future, given these factors, and considers wildlife in management. So understanding how bees fit into forest ecology may have silvicultural implications. And I saw that some folks are already working in forestry here, and we think about forest management for other wildlife such as birds. And I think that hopefully you'll maybe see by the end, I think a lot of the ways that we might manage forests for birds could be synergistic with ways that we might think about bee habitats in forests. All right, so let's get into some of the meat. Kass, you've been giving so much background. So just, say it just over and over again. We know that bees use the absolutely wonderful resources in meadows, fields, and gardens. This is still true. All those things are still correct. We also know that bees use the wonderful resources that flush after recently harvested forests, in recently harvested forest patches. So sometimes in order to keep the health of our forests and to manage for climate resiliency or wildlife, certain types of harvests are necessary. And in many cases, that actually leads to a flush of flowers and early successional habitat that's good for many species of birds as well as for bees. So all of that is true and is the background for saying, and what is also happening in the canopy, what is also happening with the ways bees might nest in complete forests. And then also there's one really cool suite of stories with spring ephemerals. So that brings me back to the outline. And we're going to talk specifically about specialists on spring ephemerals. Hopefully now with that grounding, we're ready to dive into these details. So what is a specialist bee? There are many insects and many plants. And if you're active for only a short period of time, like for example, that solitary bee's life cycle that I showed at the beginning, it might make sense to get really, really good at collecting a specific type of pollen. You can get really efficient. You can go back and forth from your nest all day without learning a new flower morphology, without having to figure out a different ratio of nectar and pollen to make the pollen stick to your legs. And then there's this other whole element, which is that if you learn to eat from a plant that bees don't like, or you just get extra good at a plant, then you've kind of made this niche where you have less competition. And so, for example, in spring ephemerals, this is the flowers that bloom in the forest in the early spring on the forest floor before trees leaf out when there's still light on the ground. One really beautiful one is the spring beauty or Claytonia. And there's an andrena called Andrena erigine that only eats the pollen from spring beauty. And by eats, I mean its young are reared exclusively on spring beauty pollen. And in fact, it's so good at it that it can even take most of the pollen from a Claytonia flower. Just a couple other highlights on this really cool interaction. Andrena distans is another mining bee that's a solitary, short-lived bee active only in the spring, and it's specialized on cranesbill pollen. These are just absolutely beautiful photos from Heather Holm where you can really see those individual pollen grains. And remember these fuzzy wasp cousins that are eating pollen. They're vegetarian because they're eating these plant parts, right? And so they have these special branched hairs where all of this pollen gathers in that mass on the legs. There's a trout lily mining bee also. And here I also have a picture of a really cool kleptoparasite who's kind of like another level of the food chain attacking the mining bees, also getting some nectar from them. There's other specialists on uvularia and on viola. And while we're thinking about specialists, there are specialists who are active not just on spring ephemerals, but throughout the year. So I just wanted to highlight this really wonderful book called Creating a Pollinator Garden for Native Specialist Bees by Maria Van Dyke and others, which highlights all of the different species of known specialist bees and what their host plants are, so you can think about supporting them in landscapes you have access to. All right, so moving quickly here now, we have shown that there's lots and lots of different specialized associations on spring ephemerals. But now let's move to nesting. So some of my absolute favorite nesting bees that really love forest habitats are these super shiny green and blue sweat bees. And I think there's some folks in this audience who, you know, maybe have learned about some of these bees before, maybe have thought about this. But one thing that's really cool about a lot of forest associated insects, which this shiny green and shiny blue sweat bee with their scientific names up top there, is that lots of forest associated insects are iridescent. So for those of you interested in a little ecological theory, go ahead and throw your guesses in the chat. And I'm not going to read them now, but I'll circle back and maybe at questions we can talk about why are so many forest associated insects shiny. So while you're thinking about that, we can keep looking at this Agochlora pura, who is nesting inside this rotting log. So they really like a certain kind of punky log that's like partly decomposed. I find them often zipping in and out of old stumps in the woods, in snags, which is a standing dead tree, in downed, in coarse woody debris or downed dead wood, in slash walls or log walls. And they're super adaptable. So I've also seen Agochlora pura in park benches in downtown Philadelphia. And when I was climbing trees up 60, 70 feet in oak trees, I found some Agochlora pura in a dead branch in an oak tree, otherwise healthy. And there was a whole group of them who are all nesting 70 feet in the sky. So that was really cool, deep in the woods there. And just so you can imagine a little bit more of what these nests look like, if you imagine this bee crawling into this rotting log, each of these little green circles is where that entrance is. And then just like we saw in the soil bee picture where they're making a pile of pollen, same thing, they make their piles of pollen in the ends of these tunnels inside the logs. Really different than honeybees, right? And then, so here's another picture of these are some Lasioglossum or some small sweat bees who are also good pollinators. And I found this one's coming kind of in and out of these holes in this downed log or branches in the woods. And then there's a lot of soil nesting bees who will nest not actually in the ground, but in tip-ups. So here I'm showing you this long tip-up, and then there's a lot of soil captured in amidst the roots here. And there was a whole aggregation of soil nesting sweat bees. They're a little bit difficult to see, but you can kind of see them cut in front of the camera here, and they were going in and out of nests up in this pot. There you can see them maybe in the light. Just zipping in and out of nests in kind of this social, they're all solitary, but they're coming in and out of nests where they all found a good spot. It's like an apartment building. And here's a citation of one other study I found that found another species who use what they were calling root plates, which I call tip-ups. So same thing. Whoops. All right. So I'm going to take a special moment to zoom in on bumblebees because they have this really specific social behavior and because there's a lot more research on bumblebees than on other species, although we still have so much to learn about bumblebees. But bumblebees mate in the fall, and then only the queen hibernates all spring, and she's able to lay both male and female eggs in the spring or whenever it's time in the colony's development in order to fully restart the colony each summer. So And they're active all year. So unlike the solitary bees who are out for just a couple weeks, and so if they have a specialized flower, they really need that specialized flower in order to survive. Bumblebees, in contrast, are active the entire season as the colony grows. And so they need to be able to switch between flowers. And so here's a really wonderful diagram from a great paper by Mola et al. That recently came out describing all of the different ways that bumblebees use forests. And so we see in the spring, both tree and understory spring ephemeral pollen is really important for bumblebees who have recently come out of their nests, out of hibernation, like bears. Then their nests may be in rotting logs, maybe in abandoned rodent burrows under the soil. These could be both in forests and out, but often are in forests. And you can see this image of a bumblebee colony, which looks quite different than honeybee colonies. And then increasingly, we're finding evidence that bumblebee queens, many of them prefer to nest, or at least have high success rates of overwintering when they nest in the leaf litter or pine needle duff or soil in the forest layer, where they then need to, just like a bumblebee, just like a bear, they stock up and get all of their resources so that they're ready to live through the whole winter and come out again in the spring. And I've seen a lot of bumblebees doing this nest seeking behavior in the spring. They've emerged and then go bumbling around the forest floor. And this was a day deep in the woods where there were blooming in the canopy. There were a few spring ephemerals, but it wasn't really what you'd think of as like a big pollinator meadow, but there were bumblebee queens just absolutely everywhere looking for somewhere to nest. A lot of these bumblebee queens also rely on spring ephemerals as well as early spring flowers. One really cool recent study that came out of Tufts did a really rigorous job trying to find bumblebee colonies, which sometimes we stumble on them in a woodpile or under our deck and we say, oh, bumblebees are everywhere. But when you're actually trying to study where they really are, it can be very difficult to find them when you're out in a field. And so this group found that there was more bumblebee nests successfully established in forests and then in meadows, and then pretty much they didn't find any in managed hayfields. And then they also found that the number of reproductive queens or gynes that were made from those nests were higher in forests than in those fields. So this was some interesting maybe suggestion that this is a broader pattern as we're finding this relationship. All right, so those are some of the ways that bees nest in the woods: coarse woody debris, this important use for bumblebees, soil nesting bees, both in the woods and in log tip-ups. And that brings me to this final area of kind of frontier biology of what's going on in the canopy. And so this was a big part of what I worked on for my dissertation. And just to start it off, we've long known, beekeepers know this, right? In the early spring, maple, willow, cherry, black cherry, and other fruit producing trees, we absolutely know that bees use those, right? Because those are trees that are reliant on insect pollination. Some other trees that are really commonly buzzing, here's some sumac, just absolutely vibrant. Another picture of willow, cannot overstate the importance of willow in the early spring for many insects. And then here, this was a recent shelterwood harvest in the Finger Lakes region. And I found on this goosefoot maple, of all things, some andrina who were both foraging and mating while in the flowers of this goosefoot maple. So just as a strong emphasis that insect pollinated trees have long been known to provide just an enormous amount of resources. If you imagine flattening out a tree and spreading it across a meadow area, you can imagine just that surface area is huge. And while we're thinking about insect pollinated trees, I wanted to highlight some cool new research out of Penn State, where wild mining bees were positively correlated with seed set in black cherry. And foresters have increasingly been noticing that black cherry regeneration has been struggling. And so this work set out to see if maybe there were some forest insect populations, whether it was flies or bees, who were part of that equation. And it seems that this same group of mining bees, which I meant to mention earlier, are also really effective orchard pollinators, were positively correlated with this pollination of the wild black cherry trees. All right, so I kind of mentioned this now just a moment ago about that huge resource volume, but really when you start to count it, the amount of nectar and pollen per tree or shrub is absolutely huge. It's hard to think about. So one cool study from Suzanne Batra showed that a single red maple tree can have over 600 nectar flowers per cubic meter, right? So think of a cubic meter, or 1,350 pollen making flowers. So that's really cool. And then I did some kind of funny research for a little while, counting the number of pollen grains that a sugar maple tree can make, a tree that we don't really think about when we think about bees, but bees love visiting sugar maple to gather their pollen, and a single sugar maple tree on average makes 100 billion grains of pollen, which is just a huge number. If you think about, you know, maybe a couple tens of thousands of pollen grains is what you need to raise a new baby bee. That when you multiply that out, it's just millions of bees, assuming they could actually gather it all. And so I've brought this up here, but most spring trees are wind pollinated, separate from the insect pollination required by, for example, cherries or our fruit trees, right, who rely on insects. These spring trees instead rely on the wind, and the spring is cool and rainy. The spring has highly variable weather. And so it makes sense that a lot of early spring trees have evolved to be wind pollinated instead. They rely on that gustiness and just make tons of pollen grains to fly out in the air in hopes of successful pollination. So when I was starting some of this research, it was really fun to find some old papers that had found a similar thing. This old paper in 1945 in Nature talked about how bees were basically said, wind pollinated plants, we wouldn't think that they really need bees. They make huge amounts of pollen. They don't make nectar. Their pollen grains are slightly differently shaped. Therefore, and here I have it in green, it is rather surprising to find that solitary bees, and that's the genus I was talking about of those really great pollinators, sometimes collect large quantities of wind-pollinated pollen, for example, oak, beech, and chestnut. And then he goes on to kind of highlight the different amounts of pollen from these wind-pollinated trees that he was collecting. And here's just a picture. This is a honeybee, but there were a lot of different species of bees visiting this pin oak at a farm that I was visiting a couple of years ago. And you can see it busily running up and down these oak catkins, gathering as much pollen as it can. And this oak was just alive with bumblebees, xylocopa and andrena, and it was very exciting. From those data, he had just kind of summarizing from that, actually a follow-up paper that he did involved showing that sometimes these pollen loads of these spring pollinators included almost entirely oak or beech or maple or chestnut. And so that's really cool, kind of evidence that they're using trees in addition to the trees we classically think of, but they'll also fly up to these other trees that we maybe hadn't thought of as bee resources. And there's increasing literature finding specifically oak as a really highly preferred resource. So I saw somebody mention Doug Tallamy higher up the line, and his work has been so important for helping so many of us learn how many different butterflies used oak as a host plant and many, many other insects. And so it's just been really synergistic and exciting to see how many bees, especially the mason bees that I think a lot of you were familiar with, really prefer both in urban and rural systems to collect from oak trees. So part of what I found in my dissertation was that if you only sample bees in the understory or in open areas, but don't also sample in the canopy, which we also did, you end up underestimating the amount and proportion of canopy pollen that bees are using. So I like to say maybe we've overlooked the importance of canopy pollen because it's overlooking us, because it's so hard to get up there and reach. All right, so can bees eat this though? Can they really survive on it? They may collect it, but maybe it's like a second choice. Maybe it's not so good. And really, we do need a lot more research on understand when and why they choose to use wind pollinated pollen. And so one recent study kind of looked at a bunch of woody species and a bunch of herbaceous species and found that there was a slightly higher success rate of insects on woody than herbaceous. Really, I think really you should think of this as just, okay, in many cases, woody species can be just as good and maybe even better than herbaceous species. But as we've already talked about, there's different times of year that we need different resources. So this is just great to say, yeah, they can also often survive on many woody species. So that's worth more research. All right, so I'll circle back to kind of that temporal component in a second and how it fits in. But for now, let's just remember that, yes, so where we started, bees absolutely need meadow and open resources. They also use resources that come in after a recent harvest in an early successional habitat patch. And then they're also highly dependent on, especially the specialists, on spring ephemerals. There's lots of cool nesting habitats that bees use in rotting logs, in snags, in stems. There's even nesting in the canopy. And then there is canopy foraging, both on insect pollinated as well as wind pollinated species. I'm going to do 3 quick flashes of other ways we think bees use mature forests that are really just scratching the surface of what research knows. So if any of you are budding entomologists, no pun intended, since I talk about buds on this slide, these are some really cool directions that you could consider. So we know that there are lots of some species, there's a subset of species of bees that will collect resins, both for nest building support, and it seems that they will collect them more when they're challenged by pathogens. And it seems to be potentially a self-medication strategy. Some of the preferred species for this are the buds of cottonwood, birch, and horse chestnut, and then also wounds and sap, such as spruce and pine. Another quick kind of snapshot of a cool interaction is that there is really high concentrations of honeydew that is produced by sap-feeding insects, such as aphids and scale insects. And there's even so much of this in certain forests in Europe that you can see this bottom citation is about honeybee keepers managing the European honeybee in Europe to collect maximum honeydew and actually create honeydew honey. But then some other cool papers showing that bumblebees will just use this honeydew, especially in times of nectar dearth. So that's a really cool interaction. And these are predominantly in forest systems, or at least on sap feeding insects that are aggregating on trees. There's also, I've talked to a bunch of different researchers about this, where people have seen these kind of gatherings of Andrena and other species gathering to mate on trees. So, and there's one really fun old quote of males of Andrena may patrol nest sites and also scent mark nearby non-blooming trees as part of their mating. So again, this is really just preliminary. There's not a lot of studies on this, but kind of repeated anecdotal suggestions that these may be preferred kind of gathering sites for mating is tall trees. And then this is a nomada kind of sleeping on this box elder seed that I found. This is a Kleptoparasitic Bee. And so they use these kind of forested areas sheltering from the wind. They may provide kind of temperature moderation. You know that there's a lot more protected microclimate inside of a woody copse than outside. And then also we think that bees may use forested areas or hedgerows as transit corridors, both due to wind and also just structure, kind of flying up above them, or using them as a refuge to move through, potentially in some circumstances. All right, so that was kind of a hidden 4.5 that I didn't quite tell you about, but when I've got to finish up because we want time for questions. So just when we talk about forest associated bees, I'm really highlighting that what we need are diverse landscapes where all habitat types are important. So bees are most active in the forest in the early spring, right? If you think about most of those biologies we thought about, some bees are certainly in the forest all year, but they're particularly abundant in the spring. And a lot of the crops who those positive relationships were found with were indeed spring blooming crops, and including orchards, right? Many of our fruits in this part of the world. And in my research, which I didn't get into in great detail, but I also added kind of a canopy component to that prior, and figure, and you see that the abundance of bees peaks in the understory and then in the canopy, and then bees moved into the adjacent orchard in these kind of forest orchard systems that I started with. And so that was a really cool kind of relationship of this temporal switch. And then just bringing it back to the history of a historically forested landscape with forest loss and now regrowth. This is a picture from New Jersey, but the same thing is true across the Northeast, where the community of bees that the landscape supports similarly will change, changed as we did as colonial land clearing, this switch from to open supporting bees, and then this really cool work out of Rutgers classified really rigorously that potentially up to 1/3 of our Northeastern bees actually do better or are strongly associated with forest-associated bees, or forest-associated habitats, sorry, forest habitats. And they also included in this a really interesting longitudinal study who found that using historical data, as forests have regrown since they have been able to, that these forest bees have also increased with forest regrowth, and that they were most abundant in larger forests. So what does this mean for a land manager? It's not to say not to have open spaces or only to have forests, but rather to think about forest as a piece of our matrix landscape. So this is again from that same picture, from that same paper where that bumblebee life cycle was. We have forest associated bumblebees, for example, who are maybe more able to survive in really higher, more dense forest. Other bumblebee species, and this applies to all bees, who really like kind of sparse forest and high matrix habitats, and then other insects that are going to really prefer minimal forest and open habitats. And so that's what it's helpful to think about. 1/3 of our species may really love forests, is to know that they're a part of that puzzle to support maximum biodiversity, which gives us maximum buffer power under changing and unpredictable future weather patterns. Yep, and so this is just the same thing. I'm gonna kind of fly through this in hopes of getting to some conversation. Some solitary spring flying forest associated bees may be fine with just those early spring resources because they're out for such a brief time. Whereas social larger bodied species need the woods and other habitats, while other bees won't need the woods at all. Oops. All right, so to take, we know we have nest searching. We know we have nectar and pollen collection from spring ephemerals. We know we have nesting in tip-ups and deadwood, and then lots of collection from both insect and wind pollinated pollen and nectar sources in the canopy. And so what you can do is think about big logs, think about protecting woody brush piles, sticks, any hugelkultur mounds. Remember your wind pollinated trees just as you would with your insect pollinated plants when you're thinking about any insecticide treatments. Remember to protect the blooms of all those species. Consider adding flowering trees and shrubs. And if you're so moved, check out the pollinator garden for native specialist bees and appreciate those highly specialized interactions. If you're on a farm, you want to think about hedgerows, edges, and shrubs as habitat, not just meadows or flowering strips, but also these woody areas. So protect those from spray drift. Generally, we talk about increasing floral diversity. So there's flowers through the year, and trees and shrubs are that important early season boost. Work with a certified ecological forester who is thinking about long-term tree diversity, long-term climate resiliency, and wildlife habitat. And most of the forest land in the Northeast is privately owned. And so if you have just a small woodlot, this is something you can do to help contribute to long-term forest health in the Northeast, both for wildlife and climate resiliency. And so then once we're in those forests, we want to think about managing for landscape scale diversity and managing for tree diversity. And so we want to think about having a patchwork quilt of successional stages with different trees at early to late successional stages across the landscape, which is consistent with pre-colonial disturbance regimes, which were frequent on both human and natural causes. And also we want to manage for tree diversity, right? We know that some species are for resin, some species host aphids that provide honeydew, some provide lots of nectar, whereas others like oak provide tons of pollen and are host plants for butterflies. And then multi-aged wood piles / snags, coarse woody debris, all of that is great nesting habitat. Also supports rodents and birds and other animals that need cover. Also old rodent burrows will in turn become bumblebee nests, so it is all connected. And then anything you can do to protect regenerating forests and spring ephemeral flowers from excessive deer browse. There's some cool forest projects thinking about using slash piles over target areas or even building slash walls to protect regenerating harvests. And minimize soil movement or any other things. We're just kind of getting a handle on how jumping worms are spreading, but they can be a major threat to seedling and spring ephemeral regeneration in the forest. And with that, I will leave it there and hopefully have time for at least a little conversation and just highlight that we have lots more resources on our website, many webinars. We have a cool new X-Kids workbook for 3rd through 5th graders and lots of ways to get involved, including lots of region-specific plant lists, habitat establishment guides, fact sheets on lots of different pollinators, and some that are geared for parks, some that are geared for for fireflies, for mosquito management programs that think about pollinators, farming, etc. And with that, I will take any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kass. That was wonderful and awesome pictures. Visually delightful.
Good. I'm so glad. So much credit to Heather Holm, among others, for curiosity. So, sorry about that. Yeah.
I was going to say we have some questions in the chat already that have been kind of flowing in. One was a resource question. So someone asked if there's a list of spring ephemerals that support native bees, and we can provide that resource afterwards. Is there a list?
Yeah, I think that I would still direct you to the book by Maria Van Dyke, which is the Developing Pollinator Habitat or Developing a Specialist Garden. I can send that link if we want to circulate it out afterwards. It's the Developing Habitat for Specialist Pollinators. And then that is based on work and a website by Jared Fowler, which you can also Google.
Great. Yeah, and we can send these resources out
okay,
afterward.
Cool. Yeah, I can send all the links then. Great. Oh, yep, and I see somebody threw it in. Thank you, Alan.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Do any bees use conifer pollen? That's a question.
So I did a lot of digestive tract analysis as part of my thesis, and I did find conifer pollen on and off, but it seemed to be a pretty small proportion of the diet and primarily seemed to be in male bee digestive tracts, which was surprising. And I think to me lends to supporting further research on the hypothesis that it's a mating or aggregation site. So maybe they're all over there and they end up kind of eating it incidentally. But it does not seem to be, at least in the Finger Lakes where I was working, a preferred source. And when I showed that kind of survival success image of woody plants being kind of like comparable or higher, none of those were conifers. And the couple times that people have tried to rear bees on pine pollen, they have not survived. So that seems to not be what they're used for. It seems to be things like resins or, cover or gathering sites, but not pollen. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
I meant to give a shout out to corn and to hemp, which do get a lot of treatments and sprays. And we know that bees just are all over those pollens, and those are wind pollinated. So in agricultural systems, think about protecting your corn and hemp, especially in the explosion of production lately.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very important point. This is a movement across the landscape issue. Do small bees find it easier to fly in forests because maybe there's less wind? Are they better able to traverse forests compared to other types of habitat? Or do we know that?
Yeah, I think that's a cool question. I don't think we know. There's definitely some really cool research showing that small bees are moving pollen farther in forest habitats to help trees reproduce than we thought they were. That was in the tropics, Specialty Jaws group, that there was like, they thought most of the long distance pollen dispersal was by large bodied bees. And then it turned out small bodied bees were doing a ton of that work, helping those trees reproduce. But those were kind of targeted bees, I think, trying to visit those flowers. And so yeah, I think it really depends. If it's a really windy, I think they'll be happy to have the wind protection. But otherwise, I think that kind of the straight shot kind of beeline that you think of, it may actually be easier to move across open habitats.
Got it. That's really interesting. I didn't know that about the long distance pollen dispersal from small bees. That's very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, it's a really cool finding.
Let's see. A couple other questions here. This one is, pollinators and flowers have co-evolved for a long time, so many pollinators are adapted to feed on certain native species of flowers and might not be able to feed on introduced tree species. What about bees feeding on the pollen of wind-pollinated flowers? Wouldn't that also work for non-native trees? I guess, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, cool question. I think that it's tricky to when we start thinking about this, because we are so trained from kindergarten, like correctly, to think of bees as pollinators primarily, right, who are doing that work of helping the plant reproduce. But it's helpful for all of this to step back and think of bees as pollen eaters, bees who are actually going to collect pollen primarily. And so their goal is not actually to help the plant necessarily. It is in a long-term sense because they want the plant to be there again next year. But in considering each visit, they're really just trying to get that pollen or that nectar to feed their babies. And so evolutionarily, I think that if these mason bees co-evolved in a landscape with oak, that they could still have a relationship where they have learned that it's a resource that they want to use, even if it doesn't end up providing that benefit to the oak tree. Whereas in many other cases, in kind of the classic pollination dance, that has become a relationship where the plant and the insect are truly really dependent on each other. But I think it's useful to kind of separate the two phenomena. I'm not sure that's helpful, but I'm happy to keep talking about that. And yes, in many cases, insects are less well served by non-native plants, primarily those that rely on them for their larval development, like the caterpillars. They just may not have kind of the chemical adaptations to eat or even to find or therefore to use that plant. So it's true. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah,
this one is
tricky questions. Yeah.
Yes. Complex questions. This one is, ash trees are wind pollinated. I can't remember if you mentioned ash trees specifically, but the question is, should we be worried about treating them for emerald ash borer if bees are using the pollen from these trees?
Yeah, so ash pretty much were wiped out in the Finger Lakes region during my thesis. And so it was truly devastating. I didn't see a ton of ash in the samples that I had particularly, but it does crop up reliably in other studies. And I did, in like a couple bees, find that they'd eaten like 100% ash pollen, just like a couple individuals. So wow. I guess is that it really was pretty widely eaten by a lot of species. And then chestnut, people are constantly going back and forth on whether it's primarily insect or wind and insect pollinated, but it is like an insect magnet. We think about the loss of the American chestnut and just like the amount of forest resource for insect pollinators that was. It's just devastating to think about. So yeah, I think we should think about ash in terms of emerald ash borer treatments. If there's actually flexibility in your timeline for application, then like, sure, consider doing it after bloom rather than right before bloom or during bloom. But I do think that if you're trying to save that tree, it's better to save the tree. Like if you have the resources and you have a targeted area that other management goals have decided to keep that ash tree, I think you should go for it. And then if there's like a couple weeks of flexibility, try for after bloom, but I would if you've already decided that you're going to invest those resources for other management reasons, just go for it is my guess.
Okay, that's good advice. It's
Yeah.
very sad. I'm sad to hear that they all went away during your thesis.
There's hope that, you know, there's resistant pockets and stuff, but yeah, people are working on it. Sad.
Yeah. This one, they said they don't have a guess, which was prompted, but they're very interested to know why forest insects would be shiny and metallic. The answer to that question.
Oh yeah, I put that out there and then didn't circle back. Probably the best guess that I've ever found in the mostly it's shiny beetle ecology literature. So again, if you're an entomologist, you want to do mechanistic studies on this, that'd be super cool. Is that it's really good for confusing predators. So if you're iridescent and shiny, which is like, it's structural, it's not based on diet, it's like part of actually the way their exoskeleton is built, that as they move between dappled sun and shade, that it confuses predators. So that's the best hypothesis we have out there right now.
Neat. It's very neat. Let's see. A couple of management questions. One is about, this is, I guess, more of a yard question than forest, but when is a good time to rake the leaves in the spring? And then there's a question about mulching. It's why not even an inch of mulch, and should we eliminate the practice of mulching altogether?
Yeah, so definitely if you're going to use mulch, use kind of the more natural mulches that'll break down, nothing that's really chemically treated or dyed. And then if you are trying to establish habitat and weed suppression is so difficult that the only way to establish your habitat is through mulch, I still want you to use mulch. But in the long term, once you have an established habitat or once your garden is in place, we recommend minimizing the amount of mulch because it does deter soil nesters. So it's not never zero, but it's going to be, you know, if you need it for establishment, but in terms of kind of a classic landscape lawn with really thick mulch, not great for soil nesting. Remember, these are the gentle, solitary, non-aggressive soil nesters who are really great, you know, pollinators. We want them to be able to access the soil.
Excellent, thank you.
Spring, we want basically to leave them to break down if you can, but if you can't, just recommend moving them to somewhere that anybody who is overwintering in them will not be destroyed. So a lot of our fireflies, a lot of our beneficial insects do overwinter in the leaves, and so if you can just move them to a corner of your property if you're not gonna if you can't leave them where they are, which is reasonable, right? And we're trying to multiple needs, so yeah.
Excellent. Let's see, this is a related question. Can you talk more about the use of mulch in relationship to transitioning sod to native habitat when the soil needs organic material? It's a specific question.
Yeah, I guess like same category of caveat of like, if you need it to then establish a perennial habitat, a lot of times restoration or habitat transformation is going to look ugly in the middle or is going to need some drastic measures in order to convert something from something like sod, which is an ecological desert, right? So if you need to add mulch, it's not that the mulch itself, I guess here's the helpful intuition. The mulch itself is not like killing bees just by existing. It's like if you're using it in really thick layers in places where you might otherwise be supporting soil nesting or supporting growth of maybe a native ground cover that could provide floral benefits. So yeah, use it if you need to, but think about why you're using it and make sure the trade-off makes sense with your long-term habitat goals.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Someone also requested clarification on providing a safe water source and what this means. It's in your list of steps at the very end.
Oh yeah, and this is from a really fantastic guide called Nesting and Overwintering Resources, which is on our website. And I think the idea with that is that sometimes during really dry habitat times of year, bees just do need some water. And so that means like have a little bit of water, but not like something they drown in. So something with like some pebbles in it. And then combined with mosquito recommendations, no stagnant water. Remember, that's one of the best ways to not have mosquitoes is to not have stagnant water. So it would be if you could have kind of like a burbling area, especially if you have mason bees, they kind of like to have a muddy area where they can gather the mud to then make the partitions between their little nest cells where their babies live.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very cute to think about.
They are just shockingly cute.
They're so cute.
Who knew you could think about bees for so long, but they just never stop being cute.
I agree. Someone asked, this is a great question. What is the best way, if any, to study bumblebee nesting, which is notoriously difficult?
Well, we can actually circulate this stuff out because it is notoriously difficult. There is a good paper also by John Mola on like ways to study bumblebees. So I don't know what perspective this person's coming from, if they're from research or if they want to participate in a community science program. But from the research angle, there is a paper that I can share out that's like a synthesis of all the different ways that people use radio tags and observational studies and flower, whatever, work with plant pollinator interactions to think about it. There's also a bunch of different groups. So if you're out west, I'm seeing that there's some people who are from out west. Thank you. There are community science bumblebee projects run by Xerces in the kind of middle of the country, and they just added 4 new states. So it's not that I don't know the states in the Midwest, it's that I don't remember which the list of the new states are, because I think there's 8 now that are all doing bumblebee atlases. So you could be a part of that work. And then there's a queen survey where folks are collecting reports on bumblebee queen nesting. Do you know that project, Rosemary, what it's called off the top of your head?
I believe it's Queen Quest.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So folks can Queen Quest and join that. Or yeah.
Yeah, to find hibernating bumblebees, which is also they're also very difficult to find. You can report the ones that you find through Queen Quest. And I just looked back up, the person who asked that question is in Jessica Forrest's lab in Ottawa.
Oh, amazing. That's
cool.
Great. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. Thank you for tuning in.
Yeah, 100%. Very cool. So yeah, feel free to email after if you aren't finding those things.
Awesome. Thank you. I also had a question. So
yeah.
You mentioned the bees collecting resin, but this is not just resin bees that are collecting resin, is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
When they have a pathogen infection?
Yeah, it was mostly resin bees and then honeybees.
Okay.
But yeah, it was mostly honeybees and resin bees.
Okay. And the thought there is that there's something in the resin that's like antimicrobial, or is that?
And have secondary compounds, but not ever mechanistically disentangled.
Understood. Yeah. Okay.
That's the idea.
That's amazing. That's very cool.
And they're very kind of preliminary, like we found this resin and here's the ratios, and then here's this evidence of increased collection following pathogen challenge by fungi, but we don't know why. They're very tantalizing studies.
Yes, so. I want to know.
Yeah, me too. This is wild. The honeydew stuff, there's tons of like anecdotal and small papers on honeydew stuff, which is really fun.
That's very cool. I feel like I've actually saw something like that at some point. I feel like it was honeybees though, but I was down in Texas and it was very weird. I had never seen anything like that before.
Do you know what plant it was on, or like
I can't remember, but if I go back to my pictures from that trip, I might be able to figure it out, because I'm pretty sure I took pictures because I thought it was cool.
So cool. Yeah, I think it's absolutely wild. It's just fun.
It's awesome. I think the other question I had was about the cherry trees. You meant I think I just didn't quite catch it. It was you said it was Penn State studies. It was in Pennsylvania. The wild cherry trees were not doing well, and that somehow bees were part of that equation. What was the exact connection there?
It was correlative. It's brand new research that just came out like this past year. Yeah, so basically kind of typical regeneration harvests, as I've understood it, were struggling to get the amount of seed fall and like seedling regeneration that they expected. And so these folks out of out of Penn State, Rachel McLaughlin. I think she's in Harlan Patch and maybe Christina Grossinger's lab, or maybe just they closely collaborate. We're looking at, she used lifts into the trees and then collected the community, and then also did fruit set and seed set. But then it was correlative, and found that as abundance of Andrina increased, there was higher fruit set and seed set in the black cherry trees, and that it was the only genus that was true. But there was also only a very small number of bee groups that were active at that time of year. So
interesting. Okay, cool. I'll have to check that out. Okay, I'll move on from my own personal questions. Oh, there's some more coming in. We have only, I think we're going to go to Kass, do you mind staying on for like another few minutes?
I don't mind at all. I ran longer than I planned, so I'm happy to. I apologize for not leaving enough time to chat. Yeah.
No, all good. Okay, some questions just came in. One was sunflower pollen is believed to have medicinal properties. That's Lynn's work. And then are there forest flowers that have similar benefits that we know of?
I don't think that research has been done. As far as I know, that the folk like Lynn Adler's group has mostly worked with Asteraceae and primarily with Pollinators. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned, and I'm sure that there are other species that have those positive relationships, but so far that's only been kind of really concretely shown with Asteraceae as far as I know.
Okay, great. This is a question about carbon. I'm not sure that's, that's a good question. But
don't know. I see it. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, the question is for the audience is about grass-borne soil carbon. I don't know the answer to that either. So that's a great question though.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I think we may have gotten to those last questions. And I see a lot of people asking or noting things about medicinal plants. It's a really like early area of study and
very early
and totally fascinating.
Yeah, super cool. I mean, and like we know that one cool thing that we know about nutrition, which is different than medicinal, so making a clear distinction there, is that like bumblebees who are foraging over the year will maintain the protein lipid ratios of their brood provisions across the whole season, even as the floral availability, right? You think totally different things are blooming in spring than are blooming in summer, than are blooming in fall, but they're somehow at this level of a social colony calibrating their protein lipid ratios. So like, we know bees are doing really smart things. I'm sure that they're also doing certain types of medicinal stuff in a way where we don't want to like overstate we don't want to anthropomorphize more than is fair, but also know that they really are making really, really interesting choices. So yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think my last question for you is just that I guess I wanted to note and emphasize that bees and trees, or understanding pollinators and woody habitats, is also a very sort of understudied area, and I really appreciate that you've done that work. How, I guess my question to you is that I think one of the reasons why it's not done right is because it's very difficult to do. So in your field work, how did you navigate that, and how did you approach that? What did you do? How did you get into the trees is really my question.
Sorry I didn't do all of that. Folks who are still on, thank you for sticking around. I did a lot of tree climbing for my research. So that was like when I was talking about the nesting in the canopy that I saw, this kind of really cool anecdotal stuff that made me feel like, okay, there's actually something happening way up here, was because I had climbed a lot of different trees using kind of classic arborist techniques. So you use a giant slingshot you throw like a 7-foot pole, and it has a huge bungee, and it sends this weight way up over the tree, 70 feet high. And then that little slippery rope you can put it where you want it. And then you can tie onto it a really strong climb line. And then you can climb up to the top of the tree. So I did that a lot, but then for any researchers who are still listening, like it's really hard to be in enough trees enough times to get any sort of replicated data from climbing. So you can't necessarily ask community-wide replicated landscape questions with, I even recruited a bunch of really amazing undergrads from the Cornell tree climbing community, which is vibrant and is why I was able to do this work. And then we weren't able to be in enough trees at once. So folks may have heard of the kind of bee bowl strategy or pan trapping, where you use white, yellow, and blue pan traps and put them out. And there's a vibrant discussion about the pluses and minuses of this sampling strategy, but I adapted it to work in the canopy and in the understory, so using a pulley system. So then kind of to complement all of the climbing that I did, where I saw a lot of cool anecdotal things, then we put out the traps in the canopy and the understory in many, many trees in many, many landscapes, and then just had to use this little pulley system to reel down the bowls from the canopy, empty them out, collect the bees. And then final thing I'm going to say on this, because I could talk for a long time about, was just one of the problems with those kinds of traps is you don't know what the bees were doing when you caught them. So one thing I was really sure of was that when I was catching them in the canopy, you couldn't see the traps from the ground. I couldn't see them, the bees couldn't see them. So I knew they had like been up there, but I didn't know what they were doing. And so to try to get a better sense of that, this is where the digestive tracts came in. I dissected every single bee's gut and plated their digestive tracts, and then identified all the pollen that they had in their digestive tract. And so that is different than their brood provisions, but is at least some kind of snapshot of what proportions of them were interacting with which flowering trees. And I meant to emphasize this a little bit earlier, but I kind of said it was that sugar maple, red maple, and oak just swamped out they were the huge amounts of pollen that were eaten by pretty much every insect. Most of all those early spring bees. And then I'd sometimes find a bee who had eaten like 100% walnut, 100% ash, 100% birch, but they were like much smaller numbers.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So that's kind of how I tackled it, and it is really hard to do. Yeah. There's other types of,
No, I thank you for describing it, because I think it's just it's important. I like getting the visual of how difficult it is to actually get that information, and again, just appreciate that you did all of that to get the data.
Yeah, it was really, really fun, and it is really hard to get those data. I feel like, the wind speed increases as you get higher off the ground. So even when you think it's good even when you think it's a good day to sample on the ground, anybody who's sampled bees, or if you've watched bees, as soon as a wind gust comes up, the bees aren't on the flowers anymore, just in a meadow or in your garden. And then the wind dies down and they're all there again. It's like 10 times the magnitude when you're up in the sky, and then it rains every 15 minutes. So having the bowls out 100% of the time was actually like really good, because get out in the morning and be like 60 degrees and sunny, and then it would be like 50 degrees and windy up in the canopy. It's like, oh gosh, this is hard. So, but then the wind would die down and there'd be just like tons of bees and syrphids and bumblebees like all in the trees, and it was like so thrilling. But
it's so cool. So
yeah, thanks for being interested.
Yeah. So we are past the time that the seminar was slated to end. So thank you, Kass, so much for staying on a few extra minutes to answer folks' questions, including mine.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It was a wonderful seminar. I learned a lot, and I can see folks in the chat have similar sentiments. So thank you all so much. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We appreciate you being here, and we hope to see you at future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.